Welcome back, my Jedi friends, and today's episode continues my theme of famous people from the past, energy profiles. And the chap that you can see in the background here is a guy called Thomas Cochrane, the Earl of Dundonald, who was born back in 1775 in Scotland. And not many people have probably heard of him, but this was one of my dad's icons that used to tell me about quite regularly. He loved the background of Thomas Cochrane. And for anyone that ever watched the Hornblower series, well, it was based on his life. So Thomas Cochrane was a very charismatic naval commander, or he went on to be, and was always in the Navy. He was there from being a young lad and joined the Royal Navy back in 1793. 1793. So he started his career as a teenager in the Royal Navy. And he worked his way up, folks. Now, Cochrane always had a strong mind and used to fall out with commanders that he thought were incompetent. So there was friction from a very young age. Cochrane always was a bit of a maverick. And eventually he was appointed as a lieutenant in 1793 above on the HMS Hind. And he just got promoted and promoted and promoted as he went along. And he was a commander by August 1801. He finally was commanding vessels and was hugely successful. During the Napoleonic Wars, he was so successful that Napoleon called him the Loup de Mer, which was the sea wolf, because he hated his tactics that caused all sorts of havoc for the French fleets. He used to go into their ports and capture vessels. And his specialist area was capturing significantly bigger vessels with more firepower and more men on them by outmaneuvering them. So one of Cochrane's favorite tactics was carrying flags for all sorts of different navies and flying the wrong flag so he could get close enough to outmaneuver much bigger vessels. This became one of his secret moves, and he took more in plunder. He also, at the time, it was standard in the British Navy that if anyone misbehaved, then they got flogged. Cochrane never flogged a single man because what he found is it was far more effective that if people needed to be flogged or weren't to be flogged, he didn't flog them. He just stopped them from getting a share. He stopped them from coming back. And he was so successful in plunder and loot that it was far more painful for people. And Cochrane knew this if they were red carded from his fleet and they stopped sharing in the plunder. So he was a maverick at the time. He really was. And he eventually got elected into Parliament. And that was in 1807 in Westminster. And this was a time, we have to bring this to life, folks, that the British Parliament, and some will say it's exactly the same now, but if you're successful in those circles, you create a lot of enemies. So there were a lot of people that were very jealous of his achievements, and his achievements were many. He'd plundered lots of enemy vessels. He'd got himself a reputation, and he'd even been captured by the French back in 1801. But he was so charismatic, he was exchanged, was probably retrospectively one of Napoleon's bad moves, is giving him back because he caused a lot more chaos for the French. But eventually he upset the wrong people in his own parliament and he was convicted for fraud. Now, whether that was real fraud or whether it was contrived around him, they needed him out. And that happened in 1814. So round about the time of just after Waterloo, when Napoleon was being neutralized. But a lot of that had happened because he'd done his job at sea and he was hugely successful and up against the odds. So many charismatic things that he did. And a lesser person, after being thrown out of Parliament and the British Navy, would have probably gone to an early retirement, but not Cochrane. Cochrane went over to South America and joined the Chilean Navy in 1818, where he commanded that in their War of Independence against the Spanish. And he was pivotal in the Chileans getting their independence against the Spanish. And to this day, folks, to this day, the lead ship in the Chilean Navy is the Cochrane. So there you go. There's a guy who likes to make an impression. Eventually, of course, being successful, upset a few people, ended up leaving the Chilean Navy and joining the Brazilian Navy in 1823, where he was very successful there. Left there in 1825 and joined the Greek Navy in their War of Independence in 1827 until 1828. So that was he was there. So four different navies. He was there commanding ships and some of the things that he was famous for. Let's look at some of the turnarounds of his accomplishments during that time, folks. So when he was in the British Navy, he had a ship with 14 guns on it, 92 crew members. And he was able to capture 50 ships, 122 guns, 534 prisoners in just 1 year. Just 1 year. He famously captured a Spanish ship called El Gamo, which was much larger and better armed, using these deception tactics that he was talking about to outmaneuver these ships. And his deception tactics were ahead of their time. He was, it wasn't the way. It wasn't chivalrous, but it didn't need to be chivalrous. It just needed to be effective. So he wasn't averse to bending the rules or to creating his own rules to match the odds that he was facing at the time. He also was a maverick. He was the first person that created exploding ships. He'd send little ships into the enemy and they'd explode. And this was devastating to the French when he fought against them. So many things that he was a maverick. He just rewrote the rules of naval warfare. And even eventually, after being thrown out of the British Navy, they welcomed him back. They reinstated him as Rear Admiral in 1832. So after being sacked, being thrown out, and then successfully commanding four other navies, he ended up coming back and commanding the British Navy. So there you go. There is Thomas Cochrane, a maverick, a maverick. From an energy perspective, what does he bring to us? He was so confident in his own skills that he created his own rules, folks. Now, within the Navy at that time, it was very strict, it was very regimented, especially with things like the floggings. But Cochrane knew that there was a better way, that there was a better way to incentivize his men. And his crew loved him because he made them all rich. He made them all rich because he was so successful. He looked after the people closest to him. He looked after the people that mattered. He highly incentivized that they act ethically with him because the ultimate punishment from being on a Cochrane ship was to be kicked off it. He didn't need to flog them. So he was reinventing the rules. He was reinventing a big system. And it's easy to forget how influential that the British Navy was. Because at the time, the British Empire was huge. The structure was very rigid. And most of the danger that he faced was from his own politicians, folks. He was his own politicians. He had knives coming at him from all directions, not just the enemy. The enemy he knew about. It was his friends, his fellow parliamentarians who were there with the knives. A bit like when we talked about Julius Caesar. If you get too popular or influential within that situation, then your own people will turn on you. And this was what happened. Unlike Caesar, he lived to tell the tale and he lived to come back because they realized they'd given away their most successful naval commander. And all of the parliamentarians had to sit down one day and think, why did we let Cochrane go? There he is going around the world being successful in other navies all around the world, and nothing would stop Cochrane. He had fortitude, he had loyalty, and he had a skill set which was completely unique at the time, which stood out amongst others. And there's so much we can learn from Thomas Cochrane. And I feel obliged to share a bit of his life story because charismatic people can get lost in history and attention goes to the usual suspects. But Cochrane is a lesser known. He's a lesser known, but he should be a greater known, especially within the British Naval circles. And bearing in mind, it was the British Navy that made the British Empire so influential at the time. He was pivotal to this, folks. So people outside of Britain will probably say, "Oh, we don't like Cochrane. Look what he did." Unless you're Chilean or Brazilian or Greek, maybe. But there you go. There is a charismatic person from history, a profile that definitely deserves to be shared. And that is the man, the myth, the legend, who was Thomas Cochrane. So, my Jedi friends, go off and find a bit of Cochrane from within you because he radiated a lot of good energy and a lot of things that can be hugely beneficial to us today. And he was one hell of a dude. Thomas Cochrane, folks, I suggest you look him up because there's plenty here on social media that you can find to really dig into his life story, and I encourage you to do so. And should you wish for more of the same, my Jedi friends, then do like and subscribe to the channel. Show it a bit of love. And if you would like more of my little excerpts, then you will find one just there.